In this video, we will be outlining the procedure to assemble the 5-meter sawmill trailer. So the frame pieces that go between the side rails will be laid out in a specific order. The way that these pieces are laid out left to right is how they will be laid out on the trailer, front to back. Just a quick note, the two pieces on the very far left will be installed later on in the trailer build. The trailer frame pieces with the square hole near the end, they will be at the front of the trailer and also at the back of the trailer. Once all the pieces are laid out on the floor, it should look like this. The square brackets will be installed on the outside of each of the joints, and the jack brackets will be installed at the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th crossbar locations. Assemble the 2 bars on the front section of the trailer. After the front section is assembled, then you can move on to the rear section of the trailer and start assembling that. Now the center section of the trailer can be assembled, and just take note that the axle crossbar is installed at the 6th crossbar location from the front to the back. The jack brackets can be installed at the joints between each section of trailer, and just install the jack bracket on one half of the joint, as we're not putting the trailer together yet. Once the 4 sections of the trailer are assembled, they can be flipped over and then set up off the ground a little bit at a level height so they can all be joined together with the jack brackets and the square brackets on the outside of the trailer frame. All the sections of the trailer have now been joined together. Each of the joints now needs to be leveled. What can happen when you join pieces of the trailer together is they can droop at the joint. So what you want to do is to loosen the bolts that hold the joint together, grab a small floor jack or something similar, jack up on the joint until a level tells you both pieces are square and level to one another, tighten the hardware, move on to the next joint. Just a quick note, there are 3 joints per side of the trailer for a total of 6 joints to be leveled. Now that the trailer is leveled, it can be checked for squareness. You do this by doing one corner-to-corner check and then doing the other corner-to-corner check, and your measurements should be within about a ½ inch or less. Locate 6 of these brackets, and they will be installed on the trailer at the crossbar locations 3, 5, and 7, going from the front of the trailer to the rear, also noting that the 4 holes will be facing up. Find the remaining 4 brackets, and they will be installed at the crossbar locations 4 and 6, this time with the 2 holes facing up. The trailer support jacks can now be installed. Simply jack up one side of the trailer, slide the jacks over the brackets, and install the locking pin to hold them in place. Move over to the other side, repeat the process. The wiring harness will be installed next, starting with the 4-pin at the front of the trailer. Work your way down the right side of the trailer and end up at the left front of the trailer, and you'll install the last marker light at that location. Use the provided clips to attach the wiring harness to the side frame rails of the trailer. At each of the 4 corners, you will install the marker lights. Simply unscrew the wiring harness, separate the light from the wiring harness, and then slide the harness through the hole, resecure it, and attach the light to the frame with the provided hardware. The front and rear rail brackets will now be installed, starting at the rear. After the rear L brackets are installed, the rear end plate will then be installed. The brake lamps can now be installed on the rear end plate. Moving on up to the front of the trailer, the drawbar will be installed next using the provided hardware and small brackets. Just a quick note, when installing the drawbar, take special care to ensure that the drawbar is straight coming out of the front of the trailer. A square can be used to ensure the drawbar is straight out of the front of the trailer. The 2-inch coupler can then be installed on the end of the drawbar using the hardware provided. The safety chains will go on the front bolt. The trailer will now be raised up via the 6 jacks, high enough so that the rear axles and wheel and tire assemblies can be installed onto the trailer. A floor jack or something similar can be used to raise the axle up to the trailer frame so that it can be secured with the hardware. There will be a total of 4 bolts that hold each axle to the trailer frame. The fender bracket can now be installed onto the upper axle assembly with 1 lock pin and 1 bolt to hold it secure. The wheel and tire assembly will be installed next. The fenders can then be installed onto the fender brackets. Place all 6 pieces of sawmill rails onto the trailer. Once you have all the sawmill rails placed on the trailer, the blue bunks will then be placed across the sawmill rails, keeping in mind that you'll want all the square tubes on the same side of the trailer, and the front and rear bunk will not have the square tubes on them. All the hardware can now be placed in through the bunks and the rails, but do not tighten yet. The sawmill rail brackets will now be installed between the 2 joints of sawmill rails with the 4 bolts provided, and this will keep the rails in line when setting them up lengthwise down the trailer. Each of the joints between the sawmill rails needs to be connected together and set perfectly level. So this is done using a small pry bar and a wrench, and then we use a set of vice grips inside of the rails to pull them together. You will repeat this process for all 4 of the joints, and this will make each side of the trailer one long single piece effectively. Now the rails will be leveled side to side and front to back, so this can be done using a 4-foot level or something similar, going across the bunks and then going across the rails, so you're checking for levelness both ways. You can tighten the L brackets to set the height on the rails, but do not tighten the bolts that hold the rails and the bunks to the trailer quite yet. The end stops will be installed next, and there will be 1 piece at each of the 4 corners of the trailer secured with 2 bolts each. You can now begin on the assembly of the sawmill carriage. You'll start with the 2 of the 4 upright posts. You'll slide them into the sawmill head while the sawmill head is still in the crate. The front upper bracket will then be loosely installed onto the 2 upright posts. Place the other half of the upper assembly bracket on the floor, slide the remaining 2 uprights into the bracket, tighten the bolts to lock the uprights in place, and then flip the whole assembly over so that the top bracket meets up with the other 2 uprights currently installed into the sawmill head. All the hardware can be installed on the top bracket assembly, and you can tighten it all, taking special care to include the bracket for the measuring scale on the right side. Part of the hardware at the front of the upper bracket will include some pulleys. Make sure they are installed with the washers on the correct side, and they will be on the lower of the 2 holes. After the top bracket assembly is tightened, you can move on to the T-handles on the sawmill head. Tighten them both, and this will lock the sawmill head to the uprights. The sawmill lift cables can now be installed. You can start with the long one, which will be installed on the left side of the sawmill carriage. It'll go up and around the first pulley, around the second single pulley, then across to the third pulley. It will go on the upper of the 2 pulleys, and then around to the 4th and final pulley, where it'll again be on the upper pulley and then pulled on over to the welded pin. The shorter lift cable can now be installed. It will go on the right side of the sawmill carriage up and over the first pulley. The second pulley, it will go on the lower of the two, and the third and final pulley for this cable, it will also be on the lower pulley and then over to the welded rod. After the lift cables are installed, you can lift the entire assembly out of the crate by using the top bracket, and once the sawmill is in the air and out of the crate, you can lower it close to the ground so that you can then install the sawmill feet on either side. The sawmill head assembly can then be lifted onto the track and trailer assembly. The push handle will be installed on the sawmill upright, and the blue bracket for the water drip will also be installed onto this push handle. With the bunk still loose, you can now run the sawmill head up and down the track a couple times, and this will actually set the width of the track to match the sawmill head. And then you can tighten the bunks, and that will lock the width. When the track width is set correctly, the sawmill head should move smoothly up and down the track, and you should not hear any grinding or cracking of the paint as it moves along the rails. We'll start with the basic adjustments, starting with the sawmill guides and guide bearings. You will adjust the assembly so that the guide bearing is about a 1/16 of an inch away from the blade, and then you will adjust the two square guide blocks so they are about a 1/16 of an inch away from the blade on the bottom and the top. You can also use a business card to achieve this gap. Take special care to ensure that your square guide blocks are actually running parallel to the blade and are not angled up or down at all. Repeat this process for the other side. At this point, the scale can be installed on the right side on the back of the sawmill head. The sight glass with indicator line can then be installed on the upper bracket. The blade can now be leveled to the bunks, and this is achieved by adjusting either lift cable and measuring the distance on the left side of the blade to the bunk and the right side of the blade to the bunk, ensuring that both distances are the exact same. Now the felts can be installed at all four corners of the sawmill feet, and these help keep the track clean while the sawmill is in motion. This sawmill will be receiving a crank lowering kit, and the steps to install this are to remove the roll pin that holds the current handle on. Then you can slide the handle off with the round plate. I believe there are two 12mm bolts that come off with it. Then the gear will be installed onto that shaft. The lower bracket assembly can be placed over the upright and then slid up into place so that the chain can be slid over the top gear. After the chain is installed over the upper gear, you can pull down on the lower bracket. This will tension the chain, and then you can tighten the bolts on the lower bracket, locking it in place. The round plate will then be installed on the lower bracket with the two bolts, and the handle will then be installed on there with the provided roll pin or the provided bolt. The battery cables will now be installed, starting with the negative. Install the negative over the negative post on the battery and the other end onto a good engine ground. The positive wire can then be installed on the positive terminal on the battery over to the long stud on the start solenoid. The water line and the water tank will be installed next. The end of the water line with the copper piece will go in the right guide assembly, and the water tank will just sit in the bracket up on top of the sawmill. On sawmills equipped with the 22 horsepower Rato engine, the fuel tank will actually be mounted up on top of the top bracket, and there will be a fuel line that will go from the tank down to the engine. Just a quick note, the fuel tank actually just sits in the bracket and it is not required to bolt it to the bracket. After the initial assembly is done, it's always a good idea to go back and check out the alignment on the drive and idler wheels and make sure the blade is actually level to the bunks as well.